Hi, this is Simon from Tokyo Productions and welcome to another tutorial for Blackmagic Fusion. And today I'm going to be following on from my previous keying tutorial and showing you a few techniques that you may not know about. So let's get started. We've got this blue screen shot here and I'm going to show you a completely different way of pulling a key using your own tools rather than any built-in keyer. So the first thing we want to do is we want to add a channel boolean. So shift spacebar, and I'm going to type channel booleans, add that. Now what I want to do here is I want to show you how to make a macro, because it's really useful to store certain types of channel booleans or even other much more complicated tools, but I'm just going to show you how to do this with the different channels. So what I'm going to do is come over to the controls here and I'm going to set all the channels to foreground red, and I'm going to do nothing to the alpha. Let's pipe the image into that and have a look what it looks like. So there we got the red channel. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to select macro, create macro. And we don't actually need to do very much because we've already set it up, but you'll see that there's all sorts of ways in which we can define this. What we're going to do is simply type red channel up here in the name, close, save, and it's going to save it into the macros folder, and let's save. I'm going to overwrite the one I've already created. And so now if we delete this and we hit shift spacebar and I type red, there we go, there's our red channel already there. We don't have to do any of that complicated stuff with setting it up. So let's go ahead and do the same thing with the blue channel, which is the other channel we need for the purposes of this tutorial. So shift spacebar, add another channel booleans. Let's copy the blue channel to each of the channels and do nothing again to the alpha. And then let's right click, macro, create macro. Now I want to point one thing out, which is that because we haven't piped anything into the background of this channel booleans, unlike that previous one, this background checkbox is not enabled. So we need to turn that on, otherwise our macro will have no input. So turn that on. Let's call this blue channel. Close, yes, and just let's have a quick look at where that macros folder is. It's in your users, library, application support, Blackmagic Design, Fusion, macros. And if you need to delete any of these, you can just pop into there and delete them from that folder. So let's save that, and I'm going to overwrite the one I've already created. I'm going to delete that, shift spacebar, blue, and now we've got our blue channel. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So the next step is that we want to invert the blue channel. So let's select that, shift spacebar, channel booleans, come over here, operations, negative. Again, let's do nothing to the alpha, and then there we go, we've got our inverted blue channel. And what I'm going to do next is add a color curve. So shift spacebar, color curves. Let's look at that on the viewer, and I'm just going to add a node here to bring down the blacks. So it's going to clear the background to black, like so. And what I'll probably do is come over here and add another one just to push up my foreground, like so. If you don't like working in this view, you can always click on the spline tab here and it gives you our spline view. Select color curves there. Let's select this zoom to fit. I kind of much prefer using this view because I've got a bit more space to play with. I can see exactly what I'm doing. So you see I can just pull that white value along like that. Let's come back to the flow view. So now we've got a sort of strange cutout that almost works, but doesn't quite. So how are we going to fill in these areas that are still black in our foreground? Well, that's where our red channel comes in. So what we can do is we can select our process blue channel, shift spacebar, channel booleans, and then we're going to set the operation to maximum. And again, I want to do nothing to the alpha. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our red channel and we're going to pipe it into the foreground input of this max operation. And let's have a look at that. And you'll see how that works. You'll see that that red is starting to fill in those areas where the blue wasn't doing its job. So now what we need to do, with the red channel selected, let's add a color curves to that. Color curves. Probably realize that all we need to do is we need to bump up the whites a bit. So let's just click here, bump up the whites just until we fill in that foreground detail. So what is a max operation, you'll probably be asking? Well, basically it looks at the values coming in to the background and foreground, and it outputs the maximum. So whichever is the brightest pixel of the two is the one that's going to be output. So it's a very useful tool to be using for matte operations for that reason. So there we go, we've got something that's not too bad. We've got a bit of a mess down here in the right hand corner, but we're going to look at fixing that in just 1 second. So now let's try cutting out our foreground using this matte. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click here on this pipe. And you'll see that gives me this pipe router, and that's handy for just tidying things up a bit. Let's pipe that over there, and let's bring this one down here. And let's right click on here, come to options, and let's have orthogonal pipes, and it'll all look a little bit tidier. So let's now come to this channel booleans here. Let's hit Shift space bar, and again add another channel booleans. And what I want to do is I want to take this and I want to pipe it into that. And then I want to set the operation to multiply. And what I want to do is I want to set the alpha to red foreground. Now that looks a bit odd, but that's because we've got our channels round the wrong way in this operation. My foreground and background need to be swapped. So I'm just going to hit Command T, and that'll swap them around, and we've got the right result. So we've now got a cutout, and there's our image. So I'm just going to paste in a background, put it here, and then I'm just going to pipe the output of this keyed image over my background, and then let's look at that merge. What I also want to do is obviously I want to do some despill. So I'm going to select this here, which is our keyed image, Shift space bar, matte, and I'm going to add a matte control. I'm going to come over to spill here. We want to select this spill color as being blue, and then let's increase the spill suppression, and let's click on the well done tab. Looking at the output of the matte control, you can see that we're suppressing that blue. And if we then look at the result of the merge here, you can see we've got an adequate key. But one of the problems, if you remember, when we look at our matte, is that we had a bit of a problem down in our bottom right hand corner here. Now obviously we could easily do a little polyline to remove that, but let's look at a different way of doing it. And so what we're going to do is create a procedural garbage matte. So that sounds pretty fancy, but it's not that difficult to do, and it's an extremely useful technique to know about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the flow area, Shift space bar, yet another channel booleans, and I'm going to set this one to negative again, and again do nothing to the alpha. And I'm going to take this matte and I'm going to pipe it into that channel booleans, which inverts it. And I'm going to add a color curves, so Shift space bar, color curves. And what I want to do is I want to get rid of this area down here. So as you can imagine, what we need to do is pump up the white value again. So I need to view that on here. Let's really crunch it up. We don't really care about preserving anything. We just want to get rid of that down there. And let's just crunch those blacks as well, because we can have a really, really hard matte for this. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a blur. So Shift space bar, blur. Let's have a look at that. And then we're going to really blur it quite a lot, something like that. And then we're going to add another color curves. So Shift space bar, color curves. Let's have a look at that. Let's again really crunch down the blacks and really crunch down the whites. And I think you can probably see that we've got this sort of outline matte now, much bigger than our foreground. And as we adjust our color curves, we can change the profile of that. So there we go. We've got that little bit in the corner there, but that's not something we're going to worry about here. You can see the difference between that. This is really what I'm trying to get hold of here. This is just too far gone to be worrying about. So the next thing we want to do is we want to invert that again. So Shift spacebar, channel booleans, operation negative, do nothing to the alpha. I would really recommend that you make yourself a macro for this negative operation, because again it'll save you an awful lot of time. So now the inverted matte looks like that, and what we can do is we can use that to tidy up that corner of our image down there. So I'm going to add a max operation, so Shift spacebar, channel booleans again, set the operation to, minimum this time. There we go. And I want to take my original matte. Let's switch to dual view so we can see this better. There's our original matte, and here is our procedural matte. And I'm going to take my original matte, pipe it into this min, and let's have a look at the result. And you can see that that has actually taken care of that corner down there, because the minimum operation is doing the exact opposite of the maximum operation, so that it will look at the two inputs and it will output the darkest pixel in each case. So obviously here it's outputting the darker pixels of our procedural garbage matte and replacing this area here of the unprocessed matte. So now we can take that, if we just come back round here, we can take that and pipe the output of this one, pipe that into the input of the keyed image. So we're now using this matte instead of that matte to create this. So the big advantage of a procedural garbage matte is that it will follow along with our action. So for example here, the girl raises her hand to spin the globe. And if we were manually rotoscoping a garbage matte, we would have to take care of that particular moment in the action. And obviously if you've got a lot of movement, it's much easier to be doing it automatically than to be doing it manually. Just wanted to point out that obviously in this instance we've built our own key, so it's a little bit different to if you were using, for example, the ultra keyer. Let's patch that in, patch in the ultra keyer. Have a quick look at that here. Let's just do a rough pick for that. Let's lock picking so I don't accidentally do anything silly. We would need to add a channel booleans to the output of this, and then we would need to set all the channels to alpha foreground here, and we would need to set the alpha itself to white, and then we get something that looked like that, and then we could process it in the same way as we've done here, and we could then multiply the result by the image just as we've done there, rather than taking the direct output of the ultra keyer. But I won't go into too much detail about that here, because what I want to do is I want to show you something else which is even more interesting, I think, and that's how we would maintain some of that original hair detail. If we look up here, we've got some really nice wispy hair that when we look at our result, we've cropped it off. So there's where's our matte? Our matte is here. It's all looking a bit bare there. We should be seeing a lot more hair detail. So how are we going to restore that? So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take my inverted blue channel, if you remember, looked a bit like that, and I'm just not going to process it quite so hard. So I'm going to click on the flow area and add another color curves, and I'm going to take this and pipe it into the color curves, and let's have a look at the result. So let's bring down the blacks just enough. Let's push up the whites as well. So I'm only really interested in this hair area here. So I'm going to go for something like that, which has kept quite a lot of it. I'm not going to worry about all this stuff around here, because what I'm going to do is add a mask. So again, let's click on the flow area and click on the polyline tool here, and I'm just going to draw around this area here, just so we're getting that hair like that. Shift S will turn that into a nice smooth curve. Okay, so now I've got my polyline and it looks like that. I'm going to select my curves, Shift Spacebar, and another channel booleans. And I'm going to set this one to a minimum again. I'm going to pipe the polyline into the foreground input, and let's have a look at the result. And what we can now do is one of two things. Let's do the simple one first. So let me just try and remember where our main mat is. Here. If we add another channel booleans after that and make it a max, we can take this and max it with that, and then we'll get our hair back. So let's try that. So Shift Spacebar, channel booleans, set this one to maximum, alpha do nothing as always, take the output of this new thing that we've created here and pipe it into the foreground input of this one here. And there we go, our hair is back and it's all looking rather nice. So what we've managed to do is pull a much softer mat for the hair and add it to our mat that's taking care of most of everything else using a max operation, and we've got that hair detail back again. So the end result is this, and you can see our hair up there looking really quite nice. But instead of doing that, we could do something even more sophisticated, and this is a trick I really like. So I'm going to delete this channel booleans which we were using to add that to our main mat, and I'm going to come to my background and I'm going to add a color curves to it. Then I'm going to take this mat here, which is our hair mat, and I'm going to pipe it into the effect mask input of that color curves. So I just need to come to the color curves and come to the channel input for the effect mask and set that to luminance, because obviously our mask is just a grayscale, it's not alpha. So let's look at our color curves over here. Let's come to the controls, and I'm just going to reduce the black level a little bit, like that. And then if we look at our merge, something rather amazing has happened. Our hair is back there, despite the fact that it's actually not in our foreground, it's in our background. So that's our foreground. And what we've done is we've color corrected the background so it starts to look like that's hair there. Let's look at it on the single viewer. If I were to bypass that color curves tool, and that's Command P, you can see the considerable difference that that makes. It really does look a lot better than if we'd tried to key it, I think. So it's often a really useful technique. Obviously in this instance it's quite easy because the hair up here is black. If your hair was blonde, for example, you'd need to do a little bit more color correction, adjust the red and green probably to try and get that looking blonde. Always remembering that what you're doing is actually color correcting the background behind everything. And it's often much better to treat fine hair detail in this way rather than trying to key it directly. Okay, so there's one other thing I'd like to show you before we go. And you remember we made a procedural garbage mat to take care of anything outside our main image area. I'm just going to tidy this up, select all those nodes, hit Command G and turn that into a group. So F2, and let's call this garbage mat. Always quite useful to make groups when you finish with something. You can always open them back up again, but it just helps to keep everything tidy. Okay, so here was our original mat here. Let's switch over to the dual view again. And what I want to do is I want to have a look at making a core mat, or a mat for the inside. So just for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to take this blue channel and not process it quite so hard. So we've got a little bit of foreground that is not fully opaque. And then what I'm going to do is going to come here and add a color curve. So I've just clicked on the flow area so it's not connected to anything. Take my mat, pipe that into there, color curves. Again, I'm going to crunch it down, so crunch the blacks, crunch the whites, obviously making sure that I'm taking care of those foreground areas that I'm concerned about. And then I'm going to add a blur, so Shift Spacebar blur. Let's have a look at that. I'll just blur this a bit, not very much, like that. Then let's add another color curves. And effectively what we're doing here is the opposite of what we did with the outer garbage matte. So again, let's crunch the black so you can see we're shrinking that in a bit. And again, if we increase the whites, we're reducing the amount of blur. So I'm going to leave it at roughly like that. And then I'm going to take my matte here, which is, let's have a look at it over there on the left hand side. So that's the main matte composited. I'm going to add a maximum to it. So shift spacebar, channel booleans. Let's set this to maximum again. Let's set the alpha to do nothing. So I hope you can follow what I've done here. Here is my core matte, and I'm going to take that output and I'm going to pipe it into the foreground input of this max here. And now we've got something that looks like that instead of like that. So that's before over on the left and after over on the right. And you can see that our core matte has helped take care of those foreground issues. So hopefully you've understood that adjusting the color curves and the blur will change the profile of this core matte, and you can do a lot of different things with it. You know, if you wanted this to be softer, you wouldn't process the whites quite so much, and so on. It's a very useful technique. You might find you're just using this for one area of your foreground rather than the entire foreground, but again, as with the procedural garbage matte, it's very useful that it will follow along with the action, and then you're not having to do this sort of work manually. And you can make do with some extremely rough, possibly not even animated manual masks, just to apply these processes to one area of your image or the other. So a number of different techniques there that I hope have been interesting and will prove useful to you. Thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you again another time.